Good morning, children. This is Part 3 video, Subject Accountancy, Chapter 5 Accounting Ratio. In the Part 2 video, we have discussed about various liquidity ratios. Okay, so quick ratio and then current ratio, cash ratio. So, in this video, we are going to see solvency ratios. Okay, so, what is solvency ratio? Solvency ratio reflects the relationship, okay? So, relationship and the firm's position and ability to meet long term and short term obligations, okay? So, this ratio helps the board of directors to find whether the company has in sufficient finance position to pay its long term and short term loans and advances. Okay, so solvency ratio indicates whether the cash flow of the company will be sufficient, whether the company has very sound financial position. Okay, so to cover its short term and long term liabilities. Okay, so if the solvency ratio is high, okay, so that means the company has sufficient resources to meet all obligation. Okay, so if the solvency is low, then the firm is not able to, that is not means it is difficult to pay its debt and hence will get bankrupt. Do you understand? So, for what purpose we are preparing solvency ratio? To find whether the company has sufficient amount, okay, sufficient cash in their hand to pay its both long term and short term obligations. Okay, so if our solvency ratio is high, what it means? So it has sufficient fund, the company has sufficient fund to meet its obligations. If the solvency ratio is low, so the company doesn't have any fund to pay its debt. Okay, yes. To know about the cash flow, we are preparing solvency ratio. Okay, so under solvency ratio, we have five types. So, debt to equity ratio, debt to capital employed ratio, proprietary ratio, total assets to debt ratio, interest coverage ratio. We can see one by one. Excuse me. So, first one, debt to equity ratio. Yes, for what purpose we are going to prepare this debt equity ratio? Okay, so it is prepared to find out the relationship between external equities and the internal equities or shareholders fund. Do you understand? So this debt equity ratio is also called external internal equity ratio. What is that? External internal equity ratio. It is determined to ascertain soundness, to predict whether the company has the capacity to pay long term finance. Okay, so long term loans. So debt equity ratio helps to find out whether the company has the capacity to pay its long term debt. Okay, so for for applying in formulas, we are going to take the amount. Okay, that is long term debt divided by shareholders fund. For this two amount, for this two variable, we are going to take from balance sheet. Do you understand? Yes, sir. So balance sheet only we are going to take that amount. So this is called a balance sheet ratio. Okay. So for a debt to equity ratio formula, long term debt divided by shareholders fund. Okay. To find long term debt, we have to apply long term debt formula, debentures plus long term loans. Okay, so for finding shareholders fund, shareholders funds equal to equity share capital plus preference share capital plus reserves minus fictitious asset. So by applying this formula we have to find debt to equity ratio. Already we did one sum, okay, numerical question, sum number 19. Refer that question. We have applied this formula debt to equity ratio and we have find this true. Okay, the second one is proprietary ratio. Okay, so the second one is proprietary ratio. So for what purpose we are preparing this? Okay, so proprietary ratio is also called equity ratio or net worth ratio or total asset ratio. Okay, so what are they? Equity asset ratio, sorry, equity ratio, net worth ratio or total asset ratio. Okay, so it helps to find the relationship between shareholders fund to total asset. Okay, so for applying shares, okay, so now we are issuing, the ex company issuing shares to the public. Okay, so what the shareholders will think, whether the company is in sound position, okay, the company has sound financial position, then only they will get the company shares. Okay, so what they will consider, they will consider the total asset of the company. If the total asset value is too high, so it is create very confident to the shareholders to invest on their company. Okay, so shareholders fund divided by total asset. Okay, so whether the company is in position to pay its shareholder, so preference shareholder, equity shareholder, for them and all they have to pay dividend. Okay, so for that only, so shareholders fund divided by total asset. Okay, so this ratio 0.1 is to 1. Okay, the total asset value is 1. Okay, shareholders fund is 50 percentage. So okay, it's good. So the company is in sound position. Okay, they can pay their shareholder. Okay, yes. So proprietary ratio equal to shareholders fund divided by total asset. Okay, the shareholders fund include equity share capital, all reserves and surpluses, etc. So total assets include, what are things we have to include? Goodwill also we have to include. Okay, some authors they will exclude goodwill from total asset. In case of the total shareholders funds are to be divided by total tangible asset. Do you understand? Okay, so the proprietary ratio or equity ratio, so equal to shareholders fund divided by total assets. Shareholders fund equity plus preference shareholders, etc. Total asset, the value of the asset of the company. Okay, so always total assets should be more than that of shareholders fund. Then the company is in safety margin. Okay. The next one is debt to capital employed ratio. So debt to capital employed is a measurement of company's financial leverage. That is, the debt to capital ratio refers to the ratio of long term debt to total of external and internal fund. Okay, debt to equity ratio, it shows the proportion of long term debt in capital employed. Low ratio, if the ratio is very low, so then it provides security to lenders. Okay, so high ratio helps the management in trading on equity. Okay, so by taking companies interest bearing debt, both the short term, it covers both short term and long term liabilities. So what's the formula? So debt to equity equal to long term liabilities divided by capital plus reserve. Okay, so then debt to capital employed equal to long term liabilities divided by capital employed. So we have to find capital employed, right? For that we have to apply capital employed equal to total assets minus current liabilities. Okay, so capital employed, what are the things we have to include? So long term debt plus shareholders funds, like that. Okay, that is equal. And then total assets to debt ratio. So this ratio measures the external coverage of long term debt by assets. Okay, the debt to total asset is an indicator of company's financial leverage. Okay, it tells you the percentage of company's total asset. So if a company owner, he won't invest all the investment in capital. Okay, the company incurs 1500 crores, whether the single person or partner is going to invest, no. So something they have to borrow from private and public banks. Okay, or from shareholders, or from debenture holders, they have to borrow some monies. So what the creditors will think, the creditors will analyze whether the company has asset or not. Okay, whether the company incurs profit or not is not a matter for them. They have an eye on asset. If the asset value is too high, the creditor will be ready to provide lump sum amount of loan to the company. Okay, so they have eye on asset. So the higher ratio indicates the asset have been mainly financed by owner. Okay, so the ratio is higher. So the owner only 90 percentage amount is invested by the owner. If the ratio is low, so there will be a creditors. Okay, so the asset value will be increased simultaneously. Okay, so the creditor have an eye on total asset. So what's the formula for that? So total asset to debt ratio equal to total asset divided by long term debts. Do you understand? So total assets divided by long term debt. Okay, so the next one, last one, interest coverage ratio. Okay, so interest coverage ratio, it deals with whether the company incurs profit to repay its interest amount. Okay, so the interest coverage ratio helps the company whether the company earns profit or not to pay its interest. Okay, if the company earns high profit only, it will be a good position to repay the interest. Okay, so the interest coverage ratio helps to find out the profit, whether the company has able to pay the interest. So that only interest coverage ratio. So what's the formula for that? Interest coverage ratio equal to EBIT divided by interest, that is earning before interest and tax divided by interest. If the ratio is high, then the company earns high profit and it's in good position to repay its interest. Okay, so see, the ratio of 6 to 7 times is considered satisfactory. So if we receive 6 or 7, okay, so then the company is in good position to repay its interest. Okay, so that is called interest coverage ratios. Okay, so a ratio measures the debt servicing capacity of a firm, and fixed interest on long term loan is concerned. Okay, so we have to pay interest for long term loans. It shows how many times the interest charges are covered. Okay, so it covers 6 to 7 times. Okay, that's all, children. So the next video we can see about activity ratio. Once again, a small recall for your better understanding. So debt equity ratio, what it covers the external equity and shareholders fund. Okay, so long term debt divided by shareholders fund. Next one, proprietary ratio. Proprietary ratio, it covers whether the company has a good asset. Total assets should be high, and it should have the capacity to pay shares dividend to their shareholders. Okay, so always total assets should be more than that of shareholders fund. So next, debt to capital employed. Here it covers both short term and long term liability. Okay, so debt to capital employed helps to find whether the company is in position to pay its both short term and long term liabilities. Okay, so always it focus on capital. Okay, through capital only they can find whether they can pay the liability. So debt to capital employed formula, long term liabilities divided by capital employed. So capital employed formula, total asset minus current liabilities. Okay, then total assets to debt ratio. Okay, so it tells the percentage of total asset that will be financed by creditors. So creditors have an eye on total asset. Okay, so if the total asset value is too high, then the creditor will be in safety position. Okay, so they will be ready to give amount, loan amount to the company. So interest coverage ratio. So before that, see, in all ratio, debt equity ratio, proprietary ratio, debt equity ratio, it covers only shareholders fund and external equities. Okay, after that, proprietary ratio also, asset is main. It mainly focus on asset. And then total asset to debt ratio also, they have main importance to asset of the company. Okay, so interest coverage ratio, it's nothing but very simple, whether the company earns profit to pay its interest. So that is called coverage interest coverage ratio. What's the formula for that? Interest coverage ratio equal to EBIT divided by interest. Okay, that's all, children. So the remaining things we can see later. That is, in next video we can see activity ratio. Okay, so under activity ratio we have six ratios. Okay, inventory turnover ratio, trade receivables ratio, trade payable ratio, investment turnover ratio, fixed turnover ratio, and working capital turnover ratio. Okay, do the sum according to this ratio. Thank you, ma. Bye.